The dress still smelled like Ren. Senna noticed it the second she pulled it over her head, alone in her sister's room with the curtains drawn, because nobody was supposed to see her in here. Rosewater, and something warmer underneath it that she didn't have a name for except that it was Ren, only Ren, and no amount of washing had gotten it out of the fabric in 3 weeks. Her hands were shaking on the laces. She made them stop. She'd gotten good at that this last year, telling her own body what to do even when it didn't want to listen, because somebody in this house had to keep functioning while everyone else fell apart. Alaric Thorne, alpha of the Hollow Pine Pack, hadn't left his study in 9 days after Ren died. Senna knew because she brought him food and carried the plates away mostly untouched, and on the 10th day she found him standing in front of the map of the Northern Territories, one finger pressed against Duskmere like he could hold the alliance together through will alone. That was the day he told her what she had to do. "You'll wear her dress," he'd said. Not asked, told. You'll stand where she was supposed to stand, and you won't open your mouth unless somebody asks you a direct question. Even then, keep it short. "Papa, I can't be her. I don't look like her. I don't move like her. You will tonight." His eyes went flat, the way they always did right before he stopped being her father and started being the alpha. Duskmere doesn't know what Ren looks like. Nobody outside this pack has laid eyes on her since she was 12 at the last treaty signing. 1 letter exchange. 1 portrait, and portraits lie, Senna. You've painted enough of them to know that. That part was true, at least. Senna had painted the portrait herself 4 years ago, the one that got sent to Duskmere as part of the marriage proposal. She'd made Ren's jaw a little softer than it really was. Ren had asked her to. If the Alpha King finds out his bride died 3 weeks before the wedding ball, this treaty is finished, her father said. The border dispute reopens. Duskmere pulls back from the shared water rights, and within a year we're fighting a war over grazing land, because I couldn't produce 1 daughter for 1 night. I'm not her replacement. Papa, I don't even have a wolf yet. If somebody asks me to shift, nobody's going to ask you to shift at a ball. He said it like she was being stupid on purpose. Maybe she was. Scared people said stupid things, buying themselves another minute of not doing the thing they were afraid of. You will smile, dance if asked. Let the Alpha King believe he's looking at his intended mate for 1 evening, and then we'll explain her absence afterward. An illness. A retreat before the binding. Something. I need time. That's all I'm asking for. He hadn't asked her, not really. He'd told her, the way he told the kennel master when to breed the hunting dogs. Senna had spent 3 years apprenticed to the pack seamstresses because her wolf hadn't come in yet, because a girl who couldn't shift wasn't much use for anything else in Hollow Pine, and her father had never once looked at her the way he looked at Ren. Ren, who shifted at 13, a full silver wolf with a coat like moonlight, who could run the northern ridge in under 6 minutes. Who danced without anybody teaching her because it just came naturally. Senna had loved her sister. That was the strange, complicated part nobody wanted to hear. She had loved Ren completely, and also spent every day of her life standing next to her feeling like a shadow that wandered too far from its owner. And now, she was wearing that shadow's dress, about to walk into a hall full of strangers and pretend to be someone she'd never quite managed to become. The dress was deep grain, the color of pine needles in winter light, silver threads stitched along the collar like frost. It fit almost perfectly. She was an inch shorter than Ren, narrower through the shoulders, and the seamstress who altered it that afternoon kept sneaking, looks at her like she wanted to say something and didn't dare. Senna looked at herself in the mirror. Brown hair instead of Ren's near black, though in low candlelight maybe nobody would notice. Same nose, same mouth, though hers pulled down at the corners when she wasn't paying attention, a habit her mother used to try and correct before she died too, years back, from something the healers never fully explained. She looked like a girl wearing her dead sister's dress. Because that's exactly what she was. There was a knock at the door. Her father's beta, Corwin, broad and quiet, who'd never once been unkind to her, which in this house counted for something close to friendship. "Carriage is ready," he said through the door. "Your father says to hurry." "I'm not ready." "You don't have to be ready. You just have to be there." A pause. "For what it's worth, I think this is a bad idea." "Tell him that." "I did." He didn't listen to me either. She pulled the pins from Wren's jewelry box, put her sister's hair combs into hair that wasn't quite the right color, practiced Wren's smile in the mirror until her jaw ached, and walked down the stairs into the front hall where her father waited in his formal black, his face calm on the surface, with all the cracks showing underneath. If you knew where to look. She knew where to look. She'd been looking her whole life. "You'll be fine," he said, which was not the same thing as "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or "thank you." She noted it anyway, quietly, filing it in the part of her mind that had gotten good at cataloging the things her father failed to say. The carriage smelled like leather and cold night air. Senna sat with her sister's dress pooling around her feet, her sister's scent rising off the fabric every time she moved. 30 miles north, in a hall lit with more candles than she could imagine, the Alpha King of Duskmiri was waiting to meet a bride who'd already been buried 2 weeks. The Duskmiri Hall was carved into a hillside, half the building stone and half of it living rock, so that walking through the entrance felt like walking into the mouth of something enormous and patient. Senna had heard stories about it her whole life. Nobody had told her it would smell like this, though pine smoke and wax and something mineral underneath, like the mountain itself, was breathing. 300 wolves, maybe more, filled the hall in rows of formal dress, and every single one of them turned to look when the doors opened for the Hollow Pine delegation. Senna kept her chin up the way she'd practiced, one hand resting on her father's arm because that was what Wren would have done, though Wren would have done it without her stomach trying to climb out through her throat. "Smile," her father murmured, not moving his lips. She smiled. It felt like wearing someone else's face along with someone else's dress. The Alpha King was already at the far end of the hall, standing near a raised dais, and Senna's first thought was that every story she'd ever heard about him had somehow undersold the size of him. Kasayan Vale was tall in a way that made the wolves around him look like they belonged to a smaller, more ordinary species. Dark hair pushed back from his face, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of storm water, gray with a ring of something almost green at the edges. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look like a man who smiled much, or one who needed to. "There," her father said quietly. "That's him. Remember, Wren corresponded with him for 2 years, but they've never met in person. He knows her handwriting. He doesn't know her face beyond one portrait, and he doesn't know her voice at all." "That's not exactly reassuring, Papa. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be true." They walked the length of the hall, and Senna counted her own steps the way she used to count stitches when a hem wouldn't lie flat. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because counting kept her hands from shaking and her mind from doing the thing it wanted to do, which was scream. Cassian Vale watched them approach. His expression didn't change. Not at first, and Senna let herself hope for exactly 4 seconds that maybe this would work. Maybe the dress and the hair combs and the practiced smile would be enough. Maybe nobody in this entire hall would look closely enough to see that the girl underneath all of it had never once in her life been the sister anyone wanted. Then, he inhaled just once. A small motion, his head tilting a fraction of an inch, and Senna watched something flicker behind those storm-gray eyes that she did not have a word for yet, though she would later. Confusion, not suspicion, not yet. Just the particular unease of a man encountering something that didn't match the shape he expected it to have. "Alpha King," her father said, inclining his head with exactly the correct depth of respect. the kind that suggested loyalty without suggesting weakness. "May I present my daughter?" There was a pause before the word daughter that Senna felt more than heard, a half-second where her father's voice nearly caught, and she wondered if anyone else in the hall noticed it, or if it was only her. Tuned to every crack in him the way she'd been tuned to them her whole life. Kasayan didn't look at her father. He looked at Senna, and the look lasted long enough that it stopped being polite and started being something else. Something that made the back of her neck go warm even though the hall was cold. "Ren," he said, testing the name in his mouth like it belonged to someone he half remembered from a dream. Alpha King. She dipped into the curtsy she'd practiced in front of the mirror 40 times that afternoon, and it came out smoother than she expected, though her knees felt like water underneath her. He extended a hand. Not to shake an offer, palm up, the same gesture her father used when greeting an equal rather than a subordinate, and Senna understood dimly that this was a courtesy not typically extended to a bride who was, in the eyes of everyone in this hall, simply cargo being delivered as part of a treaty. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, warm, careful, and for one terrible second she thought he was going to say something was wrong immediately, right there in front of 300 witnesses, because his eyes had narrowed just slightly and his jaw had gone tight. "You've grown since the portrait," he said instead. "Portraits are 4 years old, Alpha King. People change. Some things don't." He was still holding her hand. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, an absent gesture, the kind a man makes when he's thinking about something else entirely. "Your letters mentioned you didn't care for dancing. Said you found it tedious." Senna's stomach dropped somewhere near her shoes. She had no idea what Ren had written in 2 years of letters. Nobody had thought to tell her. Nobody had thought she would need to know. "I've had time to reconsider," she said, which was true in the sense that it was the only thing she could say that wasn't a lie built directly on top of another lie. Something in his face shifted again, something she couldn't name, and he released her hand slowly like he was reluctant to. "Then perhaps you'll dance with me tonight," he said, "and reconsider a little more." It wasn't a question. Not really. Senna glanced at her father, whose face had arranged itself into the perfect mask of a proud parent, though his eyes carried a warning sharp enough to cut. "Say yes. Do not make this difficult. We have come too far to unravel now over something as small as a dance." "I'd like that," Senna said, and hated how much it sounded like the truth. The dance floor was cleared for them, which Senna hadn't expected, and every wolf in the hall arranged themselves along the walls to watch, which she also hadn't expected, though she probably should have. Political marriages didn't happen quietly. Everything about tonight was a performance, and she was standing at the center of the stage in a dead girl's dress, about to improvise a role she'd only ever watched from the wings. Cassian's hand settled at her waist, and the music started, something slow with a low string under it that reminded her of the sound wind makes moving through a chimney. She knew the steps. She'd learned them the same year Ren did, even though nobody had ever expected her to actually use them. "You dance well for someone who claimed to find it tedious," Cassian said. "Maybe I lied in my letters. Maybe you did." His eyes stayed on her face, steady, unreadable. "You smell different than I expected." Senna's whole body went still, just for a beat, and she covered it by missing a step and letting him correct her, pulling her back into the rhythm with a hand that was gentler than it needed to be. "I'm sorry. Your letters smelled like lavender, the ones your father's courier delivered." His voice was quiet, pitched just for her, though she suspected half the hall was straining to read his lips anyway. "You don't smell like lavender. I don't wear the same perfume every day, Alpha King. Is that a crime in Duskmere?" Something almost like amusement crossed his face, there and gone so fast she nearly missed it. "No, not a crime." He turned her under his arm, a motion so smooth she barely felt her own feet leave the ground, and when she came back to face him his expression had gone serious again, searching. "You smell like rain. Rain and cedar, and something underneath that I can't place. It's not unpleasant, it's just not what I expected." "People change," Senna said again, because it was the only sentence she seemed capable of producing tonight, and she was starting to worry it wouldn't hold up under repetition. "So, you keep saying." The song ended. He didn't let go of her hand right away, and she felt 300 pairs of eyes on the back of her neck like a physical weight, her father's among them, watching with an expression that had gone from proud to something closer to alarm. "Walk with me," Cassian said. Not loud, not really a request either. "I should return to my father. Your father can spare you for 10 minutes. He was already moving, and her hand was still in his, so she either walked with him or made a scene by yanking free in front of the entire assembled nobility of 2 territories. And Senna had spent 19 years perfecting the art of not making scenes. They stepped out through a side archway into a stone corridor lit by torches instead of candles, the noise of the hall fading behind them until it was just the 2 of them, and the sound of dripping water somewhere deeper in the rock. "You're not her," Cassian said. Senna's heart stopped, or felt like it did, a full clean stop before it lurched back into a rhythm too fast to be steady. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." He wasn't angry. That was the strange part, the part that confused her more than anything else that had happened tonight. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, the way you'd talk to someone standing near a ledge. "I've spent 2 years exchanging letters with a woman who signed every single one Wren Thorne. I know her handwriting. I know the shape of her sentences, the way she avoided answering direct questions about her wolf, the way she always asked about my mother even though my mother has been dead 6 years and I never once corrected her because I thought maybe she simply hadn't heard yet. Alpha King, you danced like someone who learned the steps by watching, not by being taught them directly. You hesitated before answering when I mentioned dancing, like you were searching for information you didn't have. And you smell nothing like the woman whose letters I've read 100 times." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the flickering torchlight, and his eyes had gone very still, very focused, the eyes of a man doing math he didn't want the answer to. "Where is Wren Thorne?" Senna's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Every lie her father had rehearsed with her that afternoon evaporated somewhere behind her teeth, because none of them had accounted for a man who apparently paid this much attention, who noticed handwriting and hesitation and the smell of rain on someone's skin. "Please," she said finally, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. "Please, don't say anything. Not yet. Not here. Tell me where she is. I can't. Tell me why you're wearing her dress." Senna's hand went, without her permission, to the fabric at her collar, the silver thread that had felt like frost against her skin all night, and something in her chest cracked open, small and sudden, grief she'd been holding underwater for 3 weeks, finally breaking the surface at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible person. "Because she's dead," Senna said, and her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for it, hated that the truth had come out here, now, in a torchlit corridor in front of a stranger with storm-colored eyes who was looking at her like she'd just handed him something he didn't know how to hold. Hussein didn't say anything for a long moment. The torch closest to them hissed and spat, and somewhere behind the wall the music kept playing, oblivious. And Senna stood there with her sister's name breaking apart in her mouth and waited for him to do something. "Call the guards. Send word back into the hall. End the treaty right there in the corridor with 3 words and a look of disgust." He didn't do any of that. "When?" he asked instead. 3 weeks ago. Her voice was steadier now, or trying to be. Fever. It came on fast. Faster than the healers could, it just came on fast. She was fine, and then she wasn't, and then she was gone, and my father Senna stopped. Because saying the next part felt like a betrayal, even though it was the truth. My father panicked. He said if Duskmiri found out, the treaty would collapse. The border dispute would reopen, so he asked me to wear her dress and stand where she was supposed to stand, and buy him time to figure out what to do next. And you agreed to this. He's my alpha. And my father. I didn't have a version of tonight where I said no. Something moved behind Cassian's eyes, something that looked almost like understanding, though Senna didn't trust it yet. Didn't trust anything about a man she'd known for less than an hour who had somehow already caught her in the middle of the biggest lie of her life. "What's your name?" he asked. "Your actual name." "Senna." "Senna." He said it slowly, the way he'd said Ren earlier, testing the shape of it. Ren's sister. Younger sister. Nobody's replacement. Whatever my father thinks. The words came out sharper than she meant them to. 3 weeks of grief and fear finding an edge to cut against, and she almost apologized, except something in his face stopped her. He wasn't offended. If anything, he looked like he'd just heard something he'd been waiting to hear all night without knowing it. "You're not what I expected either," he said. Ren's letters were careful, measured. Every sentence sounded like it had been reviewed by 3 people before it left the house. It probably had been. My father read everything before it went out. He read everything I wrote, too, when I used to write to my aunt in the Eastern Valley, before she died. He said an alpha's daughter doesn't get to have private thoughts. "That's not true," Cassian said, and something in his voice had gone low and rough in a way that made the hair on Senna's arms rise. "Everyone gets to have private thoughts. Even in my territory, even under my rule, wolves are permitted to think their own thoughts without an alpha reading over their shoulder." "That sounds nice," Senna said, and meant it, and hated how much she meant it. Because wanting something nice from a stranger she'd lied to within the first 10 minutes of meeting him felt like exactly the kind of foolishness her father would have warned her against, if her father had ever bothered warning her against anything except being seen. Cassian studied her face for a long moment, the torchlight catching the gray of his eyes and turning them the color of rain about to fall. "I should be angry," he said. "A treaty built on a corpse walking around in her sister's dress. My advisors would tell me to end this right now, march back into that hall, and inform your father that Duskmira doesn't negotiate with liars." Senna's stomach turned over, cold and sick. Because he wasn't wrong, and she had known this was possible from the moment she put the dress on, and knowing it and hearing it out loud from the mouth of the man who held that power were 2 very different kinds of fear. "Then why haven't you?" she asked. "Because you didn't lie to me just now. You could have kept lying. You could have run the story your father gave you all the way to the end and hoped I never noticed anything past the handwriting. Instead, you told me the truth the second I asked for it directly." He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way she imagined he studied maps before a border negotiation, looking for the seam where the real shape of things might show through. "That matters to me more than you'd think. So what happens now?" "Now," Cassian said, "you go back inside that hall on my arm, and you say nothing else to anyone, and you let me decide what to do with the truth you just handed me, because I promise you, Senna Thorne, whatever I decide, it will not involve throwing you to wolves who think a woman's only value is the alliance stitched to her name." He extended his hand again, the same open palm as before, and Senna looked at it for a long moment before she understood that he wasn't asking her to trust him blindly. He was asking her to choose, the same way he'd let her choose to tell him the truth, and something about that steadied her more than any promise could have. She took his hand. They walked back into the hall together, and if anyone noticed the 10-minute absence, nobody said so out loud. though Senna caught more than one set of eyes tracking them across the room with the particular sharpness of people calculating what it meant. Her father found them near the edge of the crowd, his smile fixed in place, though up close Senna could see the strain underneath it, the way his jaw worked when he wasn't speaking. "Alpha King," Alaric said. "I trust my daughter has been good company. Better than I expected," Cassian said, and something in the phrasing made Senna's pulse jump, because it was true in a way her father didn't understand and couldn't afford to. "I'd like to speak with you privately. Tonight, if possible." Her father's smile didn't move, but Senna saw something flicker behind his eyes, a calculation running fast underneath the surface. "Of course. Whatever suits you." "Now," Cassian said, and it wasn't a request this time, and Senna watched her father absorb that, the small tightening around his mouth, the recognition that whatever was about to happen. He had lost control of the timeline the moment he walked into this hall. They went to a smaller room off the main corridor, a study lined with old books and a fire already lit, and Senna was told to wait outside, which she did, standing in the hallway with her hands folded in front of her the way she'd been taught, listening to the low murmur of voices through the door and understanding almost none of it except the rhythm. Her father's voice rising and falling in the cadence of a man pleading a case, Cassian's voice steady underneath it, rarely raised, occasionally sharp enough to cut through the wood. Corwin found her there, standing quietly a few feet away with his hands behind his back the way he always did when he was worried and didn't want to show it. "What happened?" he asked. "He knew," Senna said, almost immediately. "The handwriting, the smell, the dancing I don't know how, but he knew within minutes that I wasn't her." Corwin's face went carefully blank, which was worse than if he'd panicked, because Corwin only went blank when things were genuinely bad. "Does your father know he knows?" "He does now." The door opened before Corwin could respond, and her father stepped out first, his face pale in a way Senna had never seen, not even in the days right after Ren died. He didn't look at her. He walked past both of them toward the main hall without a word, and Senna felt something cold settle in her stomach, because whatever had happened in that room, it had not gone the way her father hoped. Cassian appeared in the doorway a moment later. "Come in," he said to Senna. "Please." She stepped past him into the study, and he closed the door behind her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire cracked in the grate. Somewhere down the hall, the music from the ball continued, thin and distant through the stone. "Your father has agreed to a new arrangement," Cassian said finally. "What kind of arrangement?" The original contract was between Duskmiri and Ren Thorn, specifically by name, sealed by both packs 6 months ago. He moved to the fire, staring into it rather than at her, and Senna understood without being told that he was choosing his words with more care than he'd used all evening. "Ren Thorn is dead. That contract is, by every rule my advisors would recognize, void. There is no treaty. Your father knows this. He's known it for 3 weeks, which is precisely why he dressed you in her clothes and sent you here, instead of simply telling me the truth and asking for time to negotiate a new agreement in good faith." Senna's hands curled into fists at her sides. He was afraid. "I understand fear." Cassian's voice had gone quieter. "I don't excuse deceit built on top of it. Not when the deceit involves dressing a grieving girl in her dead sister's clothes and sending her into a hall of 300 strangers to lie for him. I chose to come." "Did you?" He turned to look at her then, and his eyes weren't angry, exactly, but there was something fierce underneath the calm, banked like coal. "Or did you choose the only option available to a daughter who spent her whole life being told what she's for?" Senna didn't have an answer for that. She stood very still, the fire warm against one side of her face, and said nothing, because he'd found the exact seam in her that she hadn't wanted anyone to find, the place where obedience and survival had gotten so tangled together she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I've told your father, Cassian said, that I am willing to consider a new arrangement. One that doesn't involve a contract signed for a woman who no longer exists. What kind of arrangement? Cassian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low enough that she had to lean in slightly to catch it. You, he said. Senna stared at him. Me? You? He said it like it was obvious, like she should have already arrived at this conclusion herself. And maybe some part of her had. Some part that had felt his hand at her waist during the dance, and not wanted the song to end, though she'd told herself that was just nerves, just the strangeness of the whole night. I'm not part of any contract. I don't have a wolf. I'm nobody, Alpha King. I'm a seamstress's apprentice who happened to be born to the wrong father in the wrong pack at the wrong time. You're the only person in that hall tonight who told me the truth when it would have been easier to lie. Cassian moved closer, not quite touching her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke on his clothes and something underneath it, warm, like bark after rain. I've spent my whole life around wolves who calculate every word before they say it. My advisors. My guards. Even my mother, before she died, weighed every sentence for political cost. You stood in a corridor with everything to lose and told me your sister was dead because I asked you to. That's not the same as being fit to be your mate. The word left her mouth before she fully processed she'd said it, and she watched Cassian's expression change, something sharpening behind his eyes, and she realized with a lurch that she'd said the quiet part out loud, the thing neither of them had actually said yet. No. He agreed slowly. It isn't the same thing. But it isn't nothing. Either. You don't know me. I know you smell like rain, he said, and I have never once in my life met anyone who did. I know your hands were steady tonight even when your voice wasn't, which tells me you're the kind of person who holds herself together under pressure rather than the kind who falls apart. I know you told me the truth when your father told you to lie, which means whatever obedience he thinks he's raised in you, it has limits. And I know, he added, quieter, that when I held your hand during that dance, something in my chest reacted the way it's never reacted to anyone, including 2 years of letters from a woman who turned out not to be you at all. Senna's breath caught. She thought of the stories she'd heard her whole life, whispered between the seamstresses while they worked, about mates and bonds and the particular certainty that supposedly came with finding the right person. A certainty she'd never expected to experience because certainty required a wolf, and she didn't have one. I can't be your mate, she said. I don't have a wolf. I've never shifted. I'm 19 and the healers stopped even checking years ago. They said some wolves just don't. Some people are born without one. I'm one of those people. Something crossed Cassian's face that she couldn't read, quick and gone, and he didn't argue the point, though she got the sense he wanted to. Then we'll figure that out, he said. Later tonight. I'm not asking you to be anyone's mate. I'm asking whether you'd rather go home with your father, back to being the girl who apprentices with seamstresses and gets sent into dead women's dresses when it's convenient, or whether you'd consider staying here, under my protection, while we work out what an honest arrangement between our packs actually looks like. My father won't allow that. Your father, Cassian said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way that made Senna understand exactly how dangerous he could be when he wasn't being careful, is not currently in a position to allow or disallow anything. He built a lie on top of a grieving girl and sent her to deceive a foreign alpha at a formal treaty ball. If I chose to, I could end the water rights agreement tonight and let his border collapse within the season. He knows this. He agreed to let you choose for yourself specifically because he understands that his authority over you just became very fragile. Senna's mind was moving too fast, trying to catch up with a night that had started with her standing alone in her dead sister's room and was ending with an Alpha King offering her a version of freedom she'd never once imagined having access to. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "What I choose?" "Because," Cassian said, and for the first time all evening something in his composed, careful face cracked open into something raw, something that looked almost like fear. "I have spent 6 years since my mother died being told exactly what an Alpha King is supposed to want, and exactly none of it has ever felt like this." Senna didn't answer right away. The fire popped in the grate, and somewhere outside the study the ball continued without them. 300 wolves dancing under candlelight, entirely unaware that the treaty they'd all come to witness had just quietly stopped existing. "If I stay," she said finally, "what happens to my father? To Hollow Pine? That depends on what you decide, and on what your father is willing to negotiate honestly. Now that the lie is over," Cassian's voice had gone level again, the fierce edge tucked back under composure. "I have no interest in punishing an entire pack for one alpha's poor judgment. The water rights matter to your people whether or not you become anyone's mate. I'm not a man who lets innocent wolves starve over a border dispute because their leader panicked. That's more mercy than he deserves." Probably, mercy rarely tracks what people deserve. A faint, humorless smile. If it did, most of us would be in worse trouble than we are. Her father was waiting in the corridor when they emerged, face gray in the torchlight, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Senna searched his expression for some trace of the man who used to lift her onto his shoulders before Ren was born, before there was a golden daughter to compare her against, and found only exhaustion and the particular fear of a man watching his authority dissolve in real time. "Senna," he said, "come home. We'll discuss this as a family. You mean you'll discuss it, and I'll listen." The words came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "That's how it's always worked, Papa. This is not the place I'm staying," Senna said, and the corridor went very quiet, even Corwin, standing a few feet back with his hands folded, going still in the way he did when he sensed a shift in the wind. "Not because I don't love Hollow Pine. Because for the first time in my life somebody asked me what I wanted instead of telling me what I was for." Her father's face did something complicated, grief and anger and something that might have been shame all moving across it at once before he mastered it back into the careful blankness of an alpha in public. "You understand what you're giving up," he said quietly. "A place. A pack. A name. I understand what I never had in the first place," Senna said. "You can call it giving something up if that helps you sleep tonight." He left without another word, his boots echoing down the stone corridor, Corwin trailing a few steps behind, though he paused at the threshold long enough to catch Senna's eye and give her a small nod, the kind of nod that meant more than most speeches would have. Cassian's advisor found them not 20 minutes later, a lean gray-haired wolf named Thane, who moved like a man perpetually calculating cost and benefit, and whose first words to Senna were not a greeting. "This is reckless," Thane said, directly to Cassian, as though she weren't standing 3 feet away. "A treaty built on a lie, and your solution is to install the liar's sister in her place. What happens when Hollow Pine's neighbors hear their alpha's daughter died and was replaced at a formal ball? What happens to Duskmiri's standing when other packs realize we can be deceived this easily?" "Nobody deceived me," Cassian said, and something in his tone made Thane's jaw tighten. "I discovered the truth within minutes and chose, of my own judgment, what to do with it. That is not the same as being fooled. With respect, Alpha King, the optics, Cassian cut in, will be managed by announcing that Ren Thorn passed from illness, that Hollow Pine's Alpha sought a new arrangement in good faith once the truth came to light, and that Duskmira, in the interest of the Alliance and the well-being of both packs, has chosen to consider a new match. Every word of that is true. It simply omits the hour in between where a young woman was asked to do something unfair to protect people who never once protected her. Thane's eyes moved to Senna then, appraising, and she made herself hold his gaze the way she'd learned to hold her father's, without flinching, without looking away first. And if she never shifts? Thane asked. If this pack ties itself to a woman with no wolf at all, then Duskmiri will have an Alpha King's mate who happens to be human in that single respect, Cassian said, and I will remind you, old friend, that my grandfather's second wife never shifted a day in her life and ran this territory's granaries better than any wolf who came before or after her. A wolf is not the only kind of strength worth keeping close. Thane didn't argue further, though his expression suggested the conversation was far from finished, and Senna understood, watching him go, that she had just made an enemy in this hall whether she'd meant to or not. The room they gave her was 3 times the size of her bedroom, back at Hollow Pine, with a window that looked out over the eastern ridge and a fireplace already lit when she walked in that first night, though she'd told no one what time she planned to retire. Small kindnesses like that kept catching her off guard, the same way Cassian's attention had caught her off guard on the dance floor, because nobody in 19 years had bothered to notice what she needed before she asked for it. A maid named Odiel brought her breakfast the next morning and stayed to help with her hair, chattering easily about the kitchens and the weather and a rumor involving one of the border guards and a baker's daughter, and Senna realized somewhere in the middle of it that Odile wasn't performing politeness. She was simply talking to her the way you'd talk to anyone, without the careful distance people back home kept around the girl who couldn't shift. You've got good hands, Odile said, working a comb gently through a tangle. Steady. My mom always said you could tell a lot about a person by whether their hands shook when they were nervous. Mine used to shake all the time. Didn't look like it last night. Half the kitchen staff watched you dance through the door crack, you know. Said you looked like you'd been doing it your whole life. I was terrified the entire time. Odile laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. Most people are. Doesn't mean it doesn't look like something else from the outside. It became, over the following days, a strange and unfamiliar rhythm. Cassian sought her out in the mornings, sometimes for no reason she could identify beyond wanting to walk the same corridor she was walking, and their conversations moved slowly from careful to something looser. Something that felt less like 2 strangers negotiating a political arrangement, and more like 2 people who happened to enjoy each other's company more than either had expected to. Tell me something true, he said one afternoon, the 2 of them walking the eastern garden while his guards trailed at a respectful distance, something you've never told anyone. Senna considered this for a long moment, turning it over. I used to paint. Before I apprenticed with the seamstresses. I was good at it. Better than Ren, though nobody ever said so out loud. Because Ren was good at everything that mattered, and painting didn't matter, not for an alpha's heir who was going to shift and lead and marry well. What happened to the painting? My father said it was a waste of hours that could be spent learning something useful. So I stopped. Mostly, sometimes I still sketch, late at night, when nobody's paying attention. She glanced at him sideways. Your turn. Something true. Cassian was quiet for several steps, his jaw working the way it did when he was deciding how much of himself to hand over. I've never told anyone how afraid I was of becoming my father, he said finally. He wasn't cruel. He was distant. Governed by duty so completely that by the time he died, I realized I couldn't remember a single conversation with him that wasn't about territory, or treaties, or the correct posture for an alpha in public. I used to lie awake as a boy wondering if that was simply what happened to every alpha eventually. If warmth got trained out of you the way it apparently got trained out of him. Has it? Senna asked, quieter than she meant to. I don't know yet, he said, and looked at her in a way that made something in her chest go warm and unsteady. Ask me again in a year. There were harder days, too. A letter arrived from Hollow Pine 10 days after the ball, sealed with her father's mark, and Senna read it alone in her room by firelight, her father's familiar handwriting informing her that Corwin had been removed as beta for insufficient loyalty during a period of crisis, that the pack's finances were in worse shape than she'd realized. Tied up in debts her father had taken to fund the original treaty negotiations, and that he hoped she understood the position her choices had put Hollow Pine in. She sat with the letter for a long time before she folded it and put it in the bottom of a drawer, because there was nothing in it that was actually a question, nothing that required an answer, only guilt dressed up as information. The same tool her father had used on her for 19 years, disguised now as concern for a pack she'd left behind. She thought of Corwin's small nod in the corridor and hoped, fiercely, that wherever he'd landed, it was somewhere better than a house that discarded loyalty the moment it became inconvenient. That night at dinner, Cassian noticed the tightness around her eyes before she said a word about it, and simply reached over and covered her hand with his. Not asking, not pushing, just present. The way he'd been present since the moment he'd looked at her across a crowded hall and known, somehow, before she'd said a single true word, that something about her didn't match the shape of the lie she'd been sent to wear. 3 weeks after the ball, Thane requested a private audience with Cassian, and Senna wasn't invited, which told her before anyone said a word that whatever he'd found, he hadn't found it in her favor. She learned the details later, secondhand, from Odile, who'd heard it from a guard, who'd heard it from someone in the war room. The way news always traveled fastest through the people nobody bothered to notice were listening. Thane had sent riders to the border stations along the Hollow Pine line, quietly, without Cassian's direct order, because that was the kind of advisor he was, the kind who investigated first and explained himself afterward if anyone asked. What they'd found was this: Alaric Thorne's debts weren't simply the cost of negotiating a treaty. They stretched back years, tied to a rival territory called Ashgrove that had been quietly buying up Hollow Pine's grain contracts and calling in loans at exactly the moments Alaric could least afford them, positioning themselves to seize the pack's land the moment the Duskmere alliance failed. Wren's death, and the panic that followed, hadn't been a private family tragedy playing out in isolation. It had been the exact crisis Ashgrove was waiting for, and there was a very real possibility, Thane argued, that Ashgrove wolves had been the ones spreading word of Wren's death faster than Alaric could contain it, hoping the collapse of the Duskmere Treaty would hand them Hollow Pine's territory without a single wolf needing to fight for it. Cassian told her all of this himself that evening, sitting across from her at the small table in her room rather than the formal dining hall, his hands wrapped around a cup of something that had long since gone cold. "Your father made a mistake dressing you in Wren's clothes," he said. But he wasn't entirely wrong that the treaty's collapse would have consequences. He was simply too afraid, and too proud, to ask for help honestly instead of manufacturing a lie. So what happens now? Now I send a formal warning to Ashgrove that any move against Hollow Pine's borders will be treated as a move against Duskmere directly. His jaw was tight, the same controlled fury she'd glimpsed in the corridor the first night. And I make it very clear, publicly, that whatever happens between us, whatever we decide about a formal bond, Hollow Pine remains under Duskmere's protection. Your father's debts are his own to answer for. His people are not. Even after everything he did? Especially after everything he did, Cassian said. Punishing an entire pack because their alpha panicked would make me exactly the kind of ruler my advisors warn against becoming. I'd rather be the kind who protects people even when their leadership fails them. It was 2 nights later that the real danger arrived, not from Ashgrove directly, but from a rider bearing Ashgrove's colors, who requested audience under the guise of trade negotiations, and instead, once inside the walls, attempted to seize Senna from the Eastern Garden where she often walked alone in the evenings, her habit not yet adjusted to the idea that she might need guarding. She heard him before she saw him, a wrongness in the air, footsteps too careful, and turned just as a hand closed around her arm, rough, dragging her toward the garden wall where a second man waited with a horse. Senna didn't think. She screamed and twisted and bit down hard on the hand at her wrist with a force that surprised her, and the man cursed and struck her across the face hard enough that her vision went white at the edges. Something inside her chest, something that had been silent and sealed for 19 years, cracked. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the slow warming she'd felt dancing with Cassian, or the quiet ease of walking beside him in the garden. It was violent, immediate, a sensation like her own skin trying to split open from the inside, and Senna's vision blurred, and a sound tore out of her throat that didn't sound entirely human, low and furious, and the man holding her arm stumbled backward with an expression of pure animal fear. Guards were already running, alerted by her scream. Cassian at the front of them, moving faster than she'd ever seen a person move, and by the time he reached the garden, the two Ashgrove men were fleeing over the wall, abandoning their horse, and Senna was on her knees in the dirt, shaking. Her hands pressed flat against her own chest, where something enormous was trying, for the first time in her life, to get out. Senna. Cassian was on his knees in front of her before she registered him moving, his hands hovering near her shoulders, not touching, like he was afraid touching her wrong might break something already fracturing. "Look at me. Stay with me." "Something's happening," she managed, and her own voice sounded strange to her, layered, like two voices speaking at once, one hers and one older. Deep, something that had been waiting a very long time for permission to speak. "It hurts. It hurts like I don't understand what's happening to me." "Let it," Cassian said. "Don't fight it. Whatever it is, don't fight it." The pain sharpened, a pressure building behind her ribs like something too large trying to move through a space built for something smaller, and Senna gasped, doubling forward. And Cassian caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her back, steady even as her whole body shook against him. She started, and couldn't finish, because the word shift felt too large and too impossible to say out loud. 19 years of being told she simply wasn't built for it colliding with whatever was happening in her chest right now. Undeniable. Enormous. "Some wolves come late," Cassian said, his voice low and urgent against her ear. "Some wolves wait for the right reason. I don't know why yours waited this long, Senna, but I know what's happening right now, and I know it's not going to hurt you. It's going to hurt for a minute, and then it's going to feel like coming home." The guards had formed a loose circle a respectful distance back, and Odile had appeared from somewhere, pressing both hands to her mouth, and Senna was distantly aware of all of it the way you're aware of a room through fever, present but unreachable, because the pressure in her chest had become a roar, and her vision had gone sharp and strange at the edges, colors too vivid, sounds too clear. The smell of the garden dirt and the wisteria and Cassian's skin all hitting her at once, with an intensity that made her cry out. Her spine arched. Bone shifted under skin in a way that should have been agony, and instead felt, somewhere underneath the pain, like something finally settling into the shape it had always been meant to hold. Fur broke through along her arms, silver brown, and her hands were no longer hands, and the scream that had been building in her throat came out instead as something closer to a howl, raw and enormous, echoing off the garden walls. And then it was over, and Senna knelt in the dirt on 4 legs instead of 2. Her own wolf finally, impossibly, present, breathing hard. Every sense in her body wide open in a way nothing in her human life had prepared her for. Cassian knelt in front of her, not standing, not looming, matching her level the way he'd matched it once before in this same garden, looking at a birthmark that turned out to mean nothing at all compared to this. His eyes were wet, which she'd never seen, not once in 3 weeks. "There you are," he said softly. "I've been wondering." She didn't have words yet, not in this form, but she pressed her head against his chest anyway and felt his arms come around her, careful, solid, and understood without language that whatever had been sealed inside her for 19 years hadn't been absence. It had been waiting for a place safe enough to finally let go. It took an hour for the shift to reverse itself, her body unfamiliar with the process in both directions, and by the time she was human again, wrapped in Cassian's coat because her dress had torn in the shift, Thane had arrived at the edge of the garden with a face that had gone from suspicious to something considerably more complicated. "She shifted," he said, unnecessary, since everyone present had watched it happen. "She did," Cassian said, not looking away from Senna's face. "That changes things." "It doesn't change anything," Cassian said, and there was an edge in his voice that made Thane take a half step back. "She was worth protecting an hour ago when she had no wolf at all. She's worth protecting now for the same reason, herself, not what she can or can't do in another form." Thane inclined his head, something in his expression finally, grudgingly, settling into respect rather than calculation, and turned to organize a search for the men who'd escaped over the wall, leaving Cassian and Senna alone in the garden with the wisteria and the torn dress and the enormous, impossible fact of what had just happened between them. "I'm sorry," Senna said quietly, "for scaring everyone. Don't apologize for surviving," Cassian said, and pulled her closer, and for the first time since she'd put on her dead sister's dress 3 weeks ago, Senna felt entirely, completely like herself. Word of the attempted abduction reached Hollow Pine within 2 days. The way word always traveled faster than anyone intended, and Alaric Thorne arrived at Duskmira's gates on the 3rd morning without an announcement, without an escort, looking like a man who hadn't slept since he heard. Senna received him in the same study where Cassian had first told her the truth about the contract, though this time she sat rather than stood. And her father remained near the door like he wasn't certain he'd be permitted further inside. "They told me you shifted," he said, and his voice had a strange quality to it, something between disbelief and grief, the sound of a man recalculating 19 years of assumptions in real time. "I did. 19 years, Senna. 19 years the healers said the healers were wrong. Or maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe it just hadn't found a reason yet." She watched him absorb that, watched the particular pain of a father realizing the daughter he'd written off might have simply been waiting for a house that didn't make her feel like a disappointment every single day. "It doesn't matter now, Papa. What matters is that men wearing Ashgrove's colors tried to drag me over a garden wall 3 nights ago, and I want to know if you knew anything about the debts that made that possible." Her father's face went the color of old ash. "I didn't know they'd go after you directly." "But you knew about the debts. You knew Ashgrove was circling." "I knew," he admitted, and something in him seemed to collapse slightly, the last of the performance falling away. "I thought I could manage it quietly. I thought the Duskmere Treaty would settle things before anyone needed to know how bad it had gotten. You built an entire deception around Ren's death instead of asking for help," Senna said, not cruelly, though she didn't soften it either. "And it nearly got me kidnapped by the same people you were hiding from." He didn't argue. He stood very still, an old man suddenly, the alpha posture she'd feared her whole life gone slack around the edges, and for the first time she could remember, he looked at her the way he used to look at Ren. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know if that means anything after everything. But I am." Senna considered him for a long moment, weighing 19 years of being overlooked against the strange, small relief of finally hearing an apology she'd stopped expecting somewhere around her 12th birthday. "It means something," she said. "It doesn't fix anything. But it means something." Cassian's formal response to Ashgrove arrived within the week, a warning delivered by his own guard, plain and unambiguous, that any further move against Hollow Pine's borders, its alpha, or any wolf under Duskmir's protection would be answered directly by the full weight of Duskmir's territory. Ashgrove's response was silence, which in matters like this, Cassian told her, was usually the correct one. Corwin was reinstated as Beta within the month. At Cassian's quiet insistence, and her father's genuine, if belated, recognition that loyalty during a crisis had been exactly the wrong thing to punish. He came to visit Duskmiri not long after, standing in the same garden where everything had changed, looking at Senna with an expression that mixed pride and something like wonder. "Your mother would have been glad," he said. "She always said you had more in you than your father gave you credit for. You knew my mother well? Well enough to know she'd have liked this version of you a great deal." He glanced toward the main hall, where preparations were already underway for something Senna had only just begun to let herself believe in. The claiming ceremony. Are you ready for it? Senna thought about the girl who'd stood alone in her sister's room 3 weeks ago, hands shaking on the laces of a dress that wasn't hers, terrified of being seen, and terrified of not being seen at the same time. She thought about the corridor, where she'd told the truth because lying had finally become harder than the fear of consequences. She thought about the garden, and the pain, and the silver-brown fur, and the howl that had finally let something out of her that had been sealed for 19 years. "I think," she said, "I've been ready longer than I realized." The claiming ceremony wasn't held in the great hall. Cassian wouldn't allow it, said the hall still smelled like the treaty and the lies that had brought her here, and neither had any place in something meant to be honest. Instead, they went to the eastern garden at dawn, the same wisteria arch where he'd knelt across from a girl who thought she had nothing left to offer anyone, the same stretch of dirt where a wolf that everyone said didn't exist had finally clawed her way into the world. Odile stood witness, and Thane, whose respect had settled into something Senna suspected might one day become genuine warmth, and Corwin, who'd traveled back for the occasion with an expression that kept threatening to crack into tears he refused to let fall. Her father wasn't invited, not out of cruelty, but because some bridges take longer than 3 weeks to rebuild, and Senna had decided, quietly, that she was allowed to let that timeline be whatever it needed to be. "There's nothing to sign," Cassian said, taking both her hands in his, the dawn light catching the gray of his eyes and turning them the color of the sea right before a storm breaks. "No contract. No treaty. Nothing built on paper this time. Just this." "Just this," Senna agreed. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth, the way you gave it to me the first night we met." His thumbs moved once across her knuckles, an old habit already, though they'd known each other barely a month. "Do you want this? Not because it solves a border dispute, not because it saves your father's pack, or mine. Because you want it." Senna thought about the dress still hanging in a wardrobe in her old room, green and silver, smelling faintly of rosewater no matter how many times it was washed. She thought about the girl who'd worn it to hide, who'd walked into a hall of strangers convinced that being seen was the most dangerous thing that could happen to her. "I want it," she said. "Not because anyone's asking me to, because for the first time in my life, somebody looked at me and saw exactly who I was, dead sister's dress and all, and decided that was enough. More than enough." Cassian's hands came up to her face then, warm, careful, the same calluses she'd noticed the first night they danced. He tilted her head slightly, exposing the curve of her neck, and Senna felt the hum between them settle into something steady, something that had been building since a hallway conversation about handwriting and lavender that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone else. "This will hurt," he said. "Only for a moment. I've survived worse." "I know," he said, quiet, almost reverent. "That's part of why I love you." The bite was quick, and it did hurt. A bright, clean point of pain that bloomed outward and then, impossibly, softened into something warm, something that felt less like an injury and more like a door finally opening onto a room she hadn't known existed. Senna gasped, and felt him, not just his hands or his breath, but everything underneath, his fear of becoming his father, his grief for a mother 6 years gone, the loneliness he'd never once admitted out loud until a girl in a dead woman's dress had asked him something true and gotten something true in return. When he pulled back, his eyes had gone dark and certain, and Senna's own wolf stirred quietly beneath her skin, present now, finally, after 19 years of silence. "Senna Thorne," he said. "My mate. My queen, Cassian Vale," she answered. Man who knelt in the dirt for a stranger's birthmark and never once asked for anything in return. Odell blew her nose loudly into a handkerchief. Thane pretended not to notice. The wisteria dropped its petals slowly around them, and somewhere back at Hollow Pine, a green dress hung forgotten in a wardrobe, its rosewater scent finally starting, after all these years, to fade. 2 weeks after the claiming, Senna went back to Hollow Pine, not to stay, just to collect the things that still belonged to her. There weren't many. A box of half-finished sketches she'd hidden under her bed for years, afraid of what her father would say if he found them. A small wooden bird Corwin had carved for her 10th birthday, back when he was just a guard and not yet a beta, back when nobody in that house had decided yet what she was or wasn't good for. And the dress. She almost left it behind. Standing in Wren's old room, curtains still drawn the way she'd left them the night of the ball, Senna reached for the green silk and hesitated, her fingers hovering the way Cassian's had once hovered over a birthmark he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. "You can leave it," her father said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come up the stairs. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, or maybe she was only now letting herself see it clearly. "If it's too hard to keep." "I'm not leaving it because it's hard," Senna said. "I'm deciding whether I want it because of what it means, or in spite of what it means. And which is it?" She lifted the dress from the wardrobe, the fabric cool and familiar against her hands, rosewater faint now, fading the way Cassian had said it would, the way everything eventually did if you let enough time and enough light get to it. "Both, I think. It's the dress I wore to hide. It's also the dress I was wearing the first time somebody looked at me and saw something worth keeping." She folded it carefully, the way she used to fold things for the seamstresses, corners even, creases sharp. "I don't think those two things cancel each other out. I think they're just both true." Her father nodded slowly, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the old house creaking around them the way it always had, familiar in a way that no longer felt like a cage. "I never painted your portrait," he said suddenly. "Wren's, for the treaty. Never yours. I don't think I ever once considered that anyone outside this house would need to know what you looked like. I know. I'm not asking forgiveness. I don't think I've earned it yet." He looked at her directly, which he rarely did, his eyes doing the thing they used to do when she was very small, before Wren's wolf came in and rearranged everything about how he saw his daughters. "I'm only telling you that I see it now. What I missed. I don't know how to fix 19 years in a conversation in a doorway, but I wanted you to know that I see it." Senna held the folded dress against her chest and let that sit for a moment, not forgiving him. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while, but letting the words exist between them instead of pretending they hadn't been said. "That's a start," she said. "It's not nothing." Downstairs, Corwin waited with the carriage that would take her back to Duskmiri, and beside him stood Odile, who'd traveled with her partly out of duty, and partly because she'd wanted to see the house that shaped the woman she now considered a friend. The three of them stood together in the front hall a moment, and Senna thought about the last time she'd stood in this spot, terrified, wearing a dead girl's dress, waiting for a carriage that would carry her toward a lie she didn't know how to stop telling. This time she carried the dress herself, folded under one arm, and she carried the small wooden bird. And she carried a box of sketches nobody had ever told her were worth keeping, and none of it felt like hiding anymore. The ride back to Duskmere took most of the afternoon. By the time the carriage crested the final ridge, The sun was low and gold over the hillside, catching the stone walls in a way that made the territory look made of warm light rather than rock. Cassian was waiting at the gate, which he hadn't needed to do, which was exactly the kind of thing he did anyway, and when Senna stepped down from the carriage he simply looked at her for a long moment, taking in the dress folded under her arm, the box balanced against her hip. The particular way she stood now, shoulders back, chin level, no longer bracing for someone to tell her she wasn't enough. "You kept it," he said, nodding at the green silk. "I decided it could mean more than one thing." She let him take the box from her arms, his fingers brushing hers, warm and familiar now. "It was the dress I wore to disappear in. I think it can also be the dress I wore the night I stopped." Cassian's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something quieter and more certain. "Come inside," he said. "The fire's already lit. It has been for a while now." And Senna walked through the gates of Duskmiri beside him into a hall that no longer smelled like treaties or lies, carrying a dead girl's dress that had somehow, impossibly, become entirely her own. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to embers and Odile had gone to bed, Senna hung the green dress in the wardrobe, not hidden away, not folded at the bottom of a drawer, but out in the open where the morning light would reach it. She stood looking at it for a while, the silver thread catching what little light remained, and thought of the girl who had stood in front of a different mirror 3 weeks ago, terrified of being seen. Terrified of not being seen, certain there was no version of herself worth choosing on purpose. She thought Ren would have liked Kasayan. She thought Ren would have liked this version of her too. The one who'd finally, after 19 years, stopped waiting for permission to take up space. The wolf under her skin settled, quiet and warm, no longer sealed, simply hers, the way it always should have been.